Hello and welcome back to the From My Perspective podcast, where I, Jax McCarty, tell you all the names you need to know in the college football landscape that could change the football landscape in the very near future. And that little tagline, that thing I say before every single episode, really does apply today, because we have a debate on our hands that I personally don't really have my concrete evidence and concrete answer to yet, which is who is the best quarterback of the 2023 NFL draft, and in what order do the top four come? Because I think you could ask 10 different people and get a very wide mix of answers between the quarterbacks of Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Will Levis, and Anthony Richardson. I think you would get a very mixed bag based on who you're talking to about those four guys. So what I'm going to do today is sit down. I've taken three specific games from each of their seasons to talk about what I liked, what I didn't like, things I learned about this prospect, what I'm seeing as a whole. And then at the end of the video, I'm going to give you my grades for them. I'm going to give you some other grades that I had from previous draft classes. Prior to me doing this podcast, I was doing scouting reports just kind of in my meantime. So I'm going to give you some of those grades I had so you can kind of stack them up where I see them. And then overall, I'm going to give you my total rankings of those guys. But before we get into that, make sure you hit like, make sure you hit subscribe. It helps me out a ton. I'm just trying to grow the channel. And then another thing I want to hit, I'll go ahead and put a time code down here. So if you want to skip ahead and just get straight into it, you can. But I have another thing I want to announce for what's upcoming on this channel. So, if you've watched this channel very often, or you're familiar with me as a human being, you know that I do not actually have a college football team that I support. And that goes across college basketball, baseball, literally anything. And the reasoning behind this was because I grew up loving college football. But even kind of as a younger person, I realized that I wanted to wait until I selected my alma mater and, went off to a school before I had, my team. I didn't want to get locked down into, let's say if I would have grown up an Arkansas fan because I'm from the state of Arkansas, and then I went to Florida or I went to Georgia or something, and then you kind of have that weird vibe about it. That's not something I was interested in. So I said, you know what? I'm going to wait till I get a college that has the alma mater, that has the programs, the whatever. Then I went to a college that didn't have any athletic programs. So I'm a little up the creek as far as that one goes, but I've devised a way to pick my own college football team, except for I won't even be the one picking it. I'm going to leave it up to the deities that watch over the what could be considered America's pastime, what is certainly considered college's pastime, beer pong. I'm going to take 21 cups, and I'm going to go ahead and put the list of teams that I know for certain will be on the names of these cups. There will be 21 in total, 15 you'll see on your screen right now. I'm going to play beer pong. I'm going to throw one, or I'm going to keep throwing until I get one cup left. The one cup I did not hit is my team. Now you might be asking yourself, what's up with the 6 cups that you don't know? Well, I have another podcast called the IceMac MMA podcast with my buddy Alex Eisman. He is picking 6 wild cards, teams that I do not know. I have put in some requests as far as, geographically and kind of, what the kind of feel, but most of these are based off vibes. Again, I try to represent every single conference on here. I've got a couple different outliers that I kind of pick and chose through that. It's one of those things that I've been meaning to do for a while, but I've never really felt confident enough to really bear down and select a team. I really enjoyed Tennessee this year. I enjoyed UCF, SMU. There's just so many different programs that I find myself very interested in on a yearly basis. So I'm always very split on how to pick. So I'm not going to pick it all. I'm going to throw these, and then I'm going to I'm going to record me making these shots, picking up the cups, showing you the bottom of the thing, and then put basically a super edited, cut down version up on this channel in a couple days' time. So if you are interested in that, make sure to stick around. Okay, so now we will actually circle back to the point of the video that we were meant to be discussing today, which is, of course, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Anthony Richardson, Will Levis. Their abilities, what I like about them, what I don't like about them, and like I mentioned at the top of this video, I'm selecting 3 different games from each of their seasons. No, that's not the only games I watched of these guys. Most of them I watched just about every game of their year, but as far as games I want to focus on, things that I thought showed what kind of player and prospect they are the best are the ones I moved with here. So we start with Bryce Young. And before we get too deep into, talking about his film and, really just observing the player he is, I want to talk a little bit about what his perception is at this moment. And his perception is that he's the solidified QB1 for just about everybody that I've seen. And as you're going to see, his tape is going to show you a lot of why people are so interested in him. So the games I've chosen today are Tennessee, Texas, and LSU. And we'll start, we're going to move across the timeline earliest to latest in their season. So we are starting with Texas. Early portions of this game, he really establishes that short passing game and starts to get a feel of Texas's defense. The Longhorns front four, they do bring a lot of pressure, and that creates a lot of discomfort, which ends up leading to a lot of forced incompletions and just some real struggles. There's even a play that might be up right now where you can realistically, and I don't think that many people will push back on it, should have been a pick. But that pressure was just causing Bryce Young so many fits throughout this contest. It really showcased, that pressure that I was just talking about, and some of those inabilities to really get past it is showcasing his concerns with height. He is a shorter quarterback. He measures below 6 foot as far as we're all led to believe. There's pictures online of him standing next to different athletes and Coach Saban and things of that nature, and it does not appear that he is any taller than maybe 5'10". Now, we'll see at the combine where he officially measures in, but he's definitely on the smaller side for quarterbacks. That was highlighted throughout the game against Texas, but despite this, he does start figuring out how to maneuver against that pressure, against that Longhorns defense. His receivers have a couple big drops. I'd say the biggest takeaway from this game for me, though, was that he showcased a lot of improvisation skills, especially down the stretch. He's not going to extend a play like Patrick Mahomes. He's not going to break ankles like Lamar. He's not going to rifle it down the field like Josh Allen. Those are not things that are in Bryce Young's toolbox or the things that he really succeeds in, but he brings his own brand of creativity, which includes buying time in the pocket, picking up important yards with straight line running, and finding the soft spots in the defense whenever he does have that time to throw. Granted, he's not always going to be the best whenever there's a 350-pound D tackle in his face, but I think you can say that for literally every quarterback in the league. It doesn't really make him my QB1 from this game. There were plenty of struggles throughout this contest, but he's going to have more chances to prove it, like we're about to talk about here, switching over to the Tennessee game. It's a similar start, really, between the Volunteers and Texas because there's this short pass establishment that he likes doing, the pressure that forces him off script. He shows a little bit more comfort, in my opinion, early on in this Tennessee game than he did Texas. I'm assuming that was something he really did have to begin to cope with as the year moved on. He had a much better showcasing of poise and decision-making. I was really impressed by both of those aspects for him. He looked composed throughout this entire game, so it's always a really good sign whenever you're seeing that even whenever the chips are stacking up against him and his hand's not that great, he's not letting the defense know that it's rattling him. That's always something that you want from a quarterback and something that can legitimately be make or break for a quarterback regardless of their talent on the field. One thing I did notice, though, pressure from the defensive tackles seemed to bother him and faze him a lot more than edge pressure does. It seems like he has more of an issue flushing out from within as opposed to, trying to slip through the cracks whenever an edge rusher's coming off of it. Maybe it's the fact that the D tackle presents so much more of a size issue that you're not really seeing nearly as much whenever a D tackle is coming up on you as opposed to an edge rusher, but that did kind of present itself to me as something that he just really struggles with comfortability in and doesn't really know what to do most of the time whenever those D tackles finally break loose. So maybe an interior offensive line is one of the bigger priorities. If you're going to draft Bryce Young, that's one of the things you need to establish and build once he gets into the building. He does a really good job of putting his receivers in open space. That was something that, I didn't really mention in Texas or in that Texas game, but that's just something that kept popping up when he has that time. His ability to lead receivers into the open field, give them just miles of green in front of them to work with is truly, like, he just knows how to find those soft spots really, really well, which continuously impressed me as I watched this. He always knows where his options are. There were, I don't know, probably 20 plays throughout this entire film review that I did on Bryce where he would be looking down the field completely. His head would snap to the left or snap to the right immediately and get it off to that check down, get it off to a shorter target. That was just, he always seemed to have such a good grasp on what was happening on the field, which is a giant plus for me because so many college quarterbacks come out in the draft and don't really have that processing ability and don't really have that football IQ because maybe their offenses don't really require it in college. So even though this one created some ugly moments for Bryce, this was a far more impressive game to me than Texas was. So now we move on to the final game of the Bryce Young breakdown here. We're talking about LSU. Very different start to this contest. The last two, you see a lot of checkdowns. You saw a lot of feeling out the opponent. He came out guns blazing in this one and shows up some excellent manipulation to really just cause these defenders to absolutely lose themselves and lose where they're supposed to be and lose their mark. That's what he does to start this game, and it really helps drive his team down the field. Now, at the end of this drive, he gets a little bit too jittery on a broken play, ends up throwing a pick in the end zone. You can't really have that, but the alarm bells were kind of going off. He's not a traditional scrambler. He's not really a guy who looks to use that lane very often. So the fact that it kind of sprung up on him and a mistake like that happened just because the ball was a little bit too far behind. Not the end of the world for me personally because you're not going to be utilizing him in that spot very often. His accuracy slips following that pick because he's starting to put the ball too low for wide receivers. That's really the only mental note that I have, or the only note that I have on Bryce's mentality throughout this because, or negative note rather, because that was the only time he ever really seemed phased to me. Like, he could have a bad sack or, kind of miss an option or whatever, but it's next play forward. He was, for the next couple drives, really struggling with location just because he was trying to drive it away from that defender as opposed to his receiver. So it was creating this weird the pattern almost of inconsistency. His athleticism really comes into display here for me. He shows a lot more as far as what he can do in the open field. He shows off some moves. He's not going to break ankles, like I said, but he's got a varying degree to success of ability to run, and he's not a statue. He's not going to be a risk to get sacked anytime a man is in the backfield. He can move around. He's athletic. He's quick. He's just not a designed runner, so you don't really see too much from him. This game as a whole didn't change my opinion on him too much, and I am going to end each one of these sections with a little bit of a pro comp. For me, Bryce kind of reminds me a little bit of a smaller Deshaun Watson. Not associated really with anything off field or anything like that. Bryce seems like a very well-adjusted dude. Seems like he knows what he's doing, and he's got a good head on his shoulders. But, Deshaun Watson, especially in Houston, he had to do a lot more mobility, I would say, than Bryce did, but you can see very similar traits and talents, at least in my eyes, for what Bryce brings to the table and to what Deshaun brings. Okay, so the next guy we're going to talk about, we're kind of doing this in the default order that I would say I most traditionally see these quarterbacks. So we are next moving to C.J. Stroud, who hasn't, as of, all year and really the past 2 years, has been right there neck and neck with Bryce Young. A Heisman candidate 2 years in a row, a bona fide starter for a big program at Ohio State. He's even got the size advantage over Bryce. It looks like he's going to measure in at about 6'2". There's a lot to like with C.J. Stroud, especially on paper, because quality playing experience, highly rated recruit, highly had a lot of success in college. Good frame, like it all kind of works out better. He is more prototypical of what you're looking for at quarterback than Bryce is, but that is not to say that he is necessarily better than Bryce. The games I've decided to go with for CJ are Georgia, Michigan, and Notre Dame. Notre Dame being the opening week of Ohio State season, so we'll start there. He immediately shows a possible concern with some pocket mobility and awareness. Just doesn't really look comfortable, and that's something that's going to continue to develop as we talk about him. Both sides of the pocket fold completely around him, and he goes down pretty easy. When he gets up, he has some more chances with a clean pocket, and his touch and his accuracy really, really do shine. Whenever he has his time to process and be a quarterback and really just almost like scrimmage, like just being able to operate without that pressure and just letting things unfold, he is truly a talented quarterback. I mean, some of his arched deep balls, the accuracy on them is insane. Like, it is absolutely ridiculous how pretty some of those throws are, and that's a compliment both to his ability with that touch and just the fact that he's got a really good arm, because he also shows plenty of zip whenever he needs to on some of these tighter windows and shorter passing routes that he targets later on. His accuracy and timing on the move, again, circling back to that mobility, shaky at best, in my opinion. That does get helped a little bit later, though, with a absolutely beautiful throw. While on the run, he's being chased down for quite some time, makes the pass. I think it helped a lot that it was all green in front of him. Whenever he makes that pass, it was a man kind of on his heels as opposed to a man coming at him from an angle, which I do think would have caused a lot of concern for there, but he had a straight opportunity to make the throw, so I think he got to dial in a lot more in that particular section. He's athletic, he's not slow, but he's not a common threat to scramble. It's almost like he was taught that that's illegal or something. Like, he just doesn't really ever gravitate towards that. And then if you're unfamiliar with kind of the Ohio State stigma that, surrounds quarterbacks from that university, typically they're seen as guys who need a lot of work in the NFL because of how that offense is made. And, there's really not been very many success stories of Ohio State quarterbacks in the league. Some of those concerns that you typically hear stuck to that logo and that brand do appear here because Stroud so often waits for one receiver to come open instead of finding an alternative or scanning the field at all. So overall, I think there's a lot of potential with Stroud, but there's a true lack of polish that I almost was shocked by, for the fact that, he had been a 2-year starter at Ohio State and been such a prolific name in the space. So next we move on to easily Ohio State's biggest rivalry game, Michigan. Sometimes, and since we were just talking about it to close out that last game, we can talk about it to start this one. His passes are just too easy to forecast. It's a minimal amounts of trying to look off a defender or flipping that script. He's waiting clearly for his 1A target receiver to come open and to be there and make the play, where that just doesn't work in the NFL. You can't just have your eyes glued to one dude because the defense will never flinch, will never waver. You'll have half the defense over there by the time you actually let that ball through the air, just because they know exactly where it's going. That said, his accuracy and his talent carries him a lot here because his arm's so good that it's hard to stop even when you know where it's going. Like, he can truly put the ball in some incredible spots that you shouldn't be able to hit on a consistent basis, but that's what Stroud's capable of doing. He shows it throughout this game, and the remainder of this one is pretty similar to what I talked about earlier. When the pocket's clean, made some great throws. When it wasn't, he often didn't have much of an answer for it. As it stands, the amount of issues that I have with his game that are going to limit his immediate future, not to say that he can't develop and grow past them, but as far as what happens year one for CJ, they seem a little overwhelming. Some of those issues do. I would not really qualify him as a project, but I think that you're going to have to put a lot of work in to correct some of these things. And then the final game I want to talk about, Georgia. We finish up this one with perhaps Stroud's greatest, most tough matchup defensively, because Georgia had one of the best defenses all year, and they muffled a lot of quality offense throughout the season, including Tennessee, who personally, at the time that Georgia played Tennessee, I think was the best offense in the country. And that includes Ohio State, who put up crazy numbers throughout the year. That said, this might have been the most comfortable Stroud had looked, and it was the most pressurized situation too, because it was in the college football playoffs. He found just such a good rhythm throughout this game. He showed a lot of genuine wow moments that I think if you really hone in on who Stroud is as a quarterback and you really find a way to negate some of these issues and correct some of these issues, I think he could be the best quarterback in this class. Now, I want to talk about my pro comp for him before we move on to Will Levis. Both in how he's being approached. Not necessarily, actually. I think there's another player here that reminds me a lot more of this guy, but I see similarities to Justin Herbert in his game. Definitely not from a length or size perspective, but just his ability to zip it into tight windows. He's not going to actively try to run very much unless he just absolutely has to. I think that there are definitely some similarities within their game that remind me of each other. Okay, so now we go to Will Levis, who I personally consider as the most divisive player in this class because either you think he is a top 5 pick, top 3 pick, maybe even your QB1, or you think he's a second or third round quarterback at best. Like, he is just so wildly across the board for just about anybody that you look at. And it seems like the guys like you and I that are at home, not working at front offices, perceive him a lot lower than the guys who work in front offices do, because I see a lot more, anonymous NFL scout says Will Levis is QB1 than I do on Twitter, hey, Will Levis is QB1, stop hating on it, whatever. Like, I see a lot more of the quote-unquote professionals believing his hype more than I do the folks who are just kind of hanging out at home. So let's talk a little bit about his size. He is going to he's going to measure in at about 6'2". He is a little thicker than CJ Stroud, but they're about the same height, so that's what you're getting there. And Levis did obviously play in an SEC system, whereas CJ Stroud was playing in the Big Ten. So for his games that I've selected, I went ahead, and while I should have potentially gone with 3 SEC schools, I went with Florida, Ole Miss, and Miami of Ohio. And I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. We're going to start with Florida for this one. It starts with a negative, but not really one for him. It may actually be a pro for him. Kentucky's play calling, not particularly inspiring through this game. It could be a quarterback limitations issue where they have to cut the playbook in half, so Will Levis knows how to, operate with a smaller set of options, but there was a real distinct lack of complexity for Levis. They didn't really give him much of a second option unless he was going to run and become his own second option. He's got a really, really good arm, like a live arm with an exclamation point at the end of it, but he seems to still be working on getting that control down. I mean, sometimes it is just all over the shop where that ball's going. He will, soar it one moment, put it in the dirt the next, but he's got the arm that if he can kind of figure out that location of everything, it could be very, 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 very good. Some of his throws look like a shotgun blast. So if you can get away from that, it would be very appreciated down the stretch. The kid is tough as nails. That's another thing that I don't think really gets talked about enough. He gets absolutely flattened sometimes, gets right back up like nothing ever happened, and that durability and that strength is going to matter in the NFL because you're going to get hit real hard sometimes. Being able to take it, absorb it, get back up, keep it moving, very impressive thing, something Will Levis kind of specialized in at moments in time. But, at that same moment, wherever he gets laid out by the sack, it creates some pocket awareness issues, which don't really phase themselves out too much throughout his tape. He does a really good job of scanning the field, which I was kind of surprised by, and trying to find an opportunity instead of waiting on one. And, even if he does have to wait on one and nothing ever really comes to fruition, he can run. He's an athletic dude. He is very talented whenever it comes to that. He'll run physically. He'll try to bowl you over whether or not it'll work. That just kind of depends on the day, but he will take his hits and he'll handle them out as well. It's easy to see where his project label comes from, but there's a lot of things to like here, at least in my personal opinion. Okay, so we go next to Ole Miss. He opens up this game with an absolute rocket. It's off the mark by a little bit, but those athletic traits just continue to shine whenever he's on the field. It's hard to watch Levis, and you want so much more production than you're getting, but there is just so much on display at times where it all makes sense why certain people would be willing to risk it on getting him into their franchise. I will say a lot of these moments of panic in a sense, or a lot of these unproductive moments come from a real distinct aggression that he has, which puts himself in some tough spots, gets him out of some tough spots as well. It can save him, but it also hurts him quite a bit too. So you have to be aware of that. And then his decision making just as a whole, by proxy of that aggression and the mindset he carries into football, or at least the mindset it appears he carries into football, is not helping with that decision making, with that accuracy. He's trying to play hero ball sometimes, and that definitely shines through on this tape against Ole Miss. But he's not afraid of taking the big shot and seeing what happens. So that can also return dividends for you and provide you with a lot of really important plays and a lot of really monumental shifts in momentum that are worth they're worth having on your team. You've got to be prepared for things of that nature, and Will Levis brings them for you. Overall, Ole Miss game, I again didn't change just too much for me, but it did show that his talent's not always going to be able to carry him out of those rough spots, because he had a couple big fumbles. He kind of let that game slip away from him and couldn't really do much about it because some of those fundamental issues are missing from his toolbox at this moment in time. So the last game, the reason I chose Miami of Ohio is because I wanted to see him against a lesser than team and see if those tendencies stuck around, or if having a cleaner pocket and being a little bit more poised and feeling a lot more comfortable against the team they're playing was going to lead to better results for him. Now, I personally didn't really see that in this game. It didn't change much for me still, because it starts off super promising. He showcases a lot of arm strength and a lot of zip, something that's just been a constant trend here. He could be a legit star with polish, but there's just so much that needs to be developed, and all of those pieces just about are so prominent in his tape that it really does come across as a 1 or 2 year project to just get him to the point where you feel comfortable enough putting him on the field. He had all the chances in the world to be much more composed here, be a lot more conservative and pick his spots a lot more, but that didn't happen. His aggression stayed normally where it is, and I just don't really know how to proceed with Will Levis moving out of this point. Even though I'd talked about these 3 games and watched plenty more, he didn't really change a lot about himself even whenever he had to step down in competition. So I think that's just the default way he's going to play regardless of what's happening on the field. When I watch Will Levis, I notice a lot of aggression. I notice a lot of big play potential, a lot of attempting to take that deep shot, being willing to get aggressive, being willing to just grind it out and try to just outman another opponent, essentially. And that reminds me a lot of Baker Mayfield when he was coming out of Oklahoma. Baker, notoriously had a lot to say both on and off the field, but he backed it up with a lot of tough plays to make, with a lot of physicality that really Baker should not have had, being as small as he is, and just overall kind of star potential at OU, where I think Will Levis has a very similar quality, just a much less productive version. But on tape, I see a lot of, the people who like Baker. I feel like it would make the most sense to also like Levis, because they play so similarly. And if that's your style of football and that's your kind of risk to take, then Levis is the guy for you. So the last guy that we are going to talk about for this, Anthony Richardson, Florida quarterback, coming out a little bit early to be in this draft class. And, he's another one that's super divisive. I haven't heard anybody, I don't think, say that he is NFL ready. I think just about everybody in both, social media and scouting and whatever have all kind of decided, he is probably a wait a year and then play afterwards, which honestly I think could work out for a lot of quarterbacks just in general. I think very rarely do you have an actual pro-ready quarterback come out of the draft, but Anthony Richardson very far from earning that tag. So let's talk a little bit about him. He's about 6'3", he's the tallest quarterback, 6'3", 6'4", on this list that we're doing today. Decent enough frame, and he brings a lot of talent. that is very apparent, and we're going to talk about that shortly. Actually, the first 3 games that I have for Anthony Richardson, the 3 we'll talk about today: Tennessee, Florida State, and Utah. We start with Utah. Give it about 15 seconds in this one, and it might already be running. He's going to show off that athleticism that has so many teams interested in what he could become. I mean, the speed, the movement, the vision, they all shine just about any time he's holding the ball and, actually on the move with it. His arm strength flashes well in a couple different spots too, but it's pretty apparent that either his or his offense's focus isn't really interested in that. They're not really trying to develop that. That is the secondary option when he has the ball more often than it's not, which is very strange, especially in the SEC, to see that kind of come all together for Anthony Richardson. His throwing motion, very smooth, generates a ton of snap. He's got a throwing motion that I could sit and watch just about all day. I absolutely love how he releases the ball. He shows off great instincts here as well, both as a passer and just knowing when it's time to run, because that can be so important. Not even just the ability to do so. Like, you can be the fastest quarterback in the world, but if you don't know when the time to go is and when the time is to give up on the play, it doesn't really mean a whole lot of anything. So the fact that AR has that down, very comforting in that sense. He definitely does have that project tag, but if he had a season of performances like this game, he would be my quarterback 1. But, I am sorry for the spoiler alert here. This was arguably the peak of his performances, and it's just week 1 for Florida. So we move on to Tennessee now, a common opponent that I kind of tried to link up whenever I could, both get video for it and find ways to make it work on these teams. But this game just had to go on here for me strictly because you have to keep up with Tennessee's offense. It was such a talented team this year when Hendon Hooker was on the field that you genuinely, if you couldn't keep up and score 35 points on any given Saturday, you weren't going to win your game against Tennessee. You just weren't, because that's just how good that offense was. Now, with how Florida's offense is engineered, most of the pressure to keep up with Tennessee's offense laid on Anthony Richardson's shoulders. He was going to be the one responsible for this, and for the most part, I think he did a pretty good job. He picked up over 400 passing yards, 4 touchdowns total. I believe it was 2 in the air and 2 on the ground. There were flashes of power in his running game that I didn't see previously. He had some quarterback sneaks and, a couple tough spots where he's trying to push through a defender or trying to get around a defender and get to that corner where that power really did pay off, and he got some pretty good, desirably impressive results. Some ball placement issues showed up again, but that's just a common thing. I feel like it's a very well-known thing, no matter if you actually scout these guys or if you just kind of, casually watch these football games. I think you can tell that his arm is, like, the talent is there, but the ability to get it where it needs to be isn't really all that put together. And that's going to be maybe the biggest part of his game that he's going to need to work on, just the passing game as a whole. His dual threat abilities made Tennessee uncomfortable all game long, which is just a testament to how skilled he is. And while this is not the same high mark that I would give Utah and what I did give him for Utah's game, still very impressed with Anthony Richardson overall from this contest. And then the final one, we're going to Florida State now, and I could spend 5 minutes telling you just how gorgeous the touchdown pass to Ricky Pearsall was. I mean, that ball was incredible, and that's just one of these many moments that AR flashes what makes him such a special prospect if he can string it all together, because I don't think that there are any other quarterbacks in this class that have the talent and the ability that Anthony Richardson has. I mean, bar none. Now, granted, there are probably more than a few quarterbacks that start off at a better spot than Anthony Richardson does without that development, but I mean, he is just so impressive to watch play football. He is just such a freak athlete at that position that if somebody can get it figured out, he's going to be some kind of special. There are certainly moments on his tape on this game and other ones where that lack of polish just gives you so much ugly results, but he's got the highest potential in this class to me, I don't think it's anywhere near close. He won't be the first quarterback drafted, but he's got enough skill and raw ability that I can completely get a coach risking it on drafting him. So for his comps, the obvious one would be Lamar, but I've actually got a couple different options here. I think he runs pretty similarly to Colin Kaepernick. I think that they have similar tendencies in the open field and kind of how they maneuver through defenses, where RG3 is also a very worthwhile mention, just because, that dual threat nature and some of that arm talent, while also being one of the better runners in the country, regardless of position. That kind of puts him in that range. So before we jump into what I graded these guys, let's talk about some of my previous grades that I had on other quarterbacks from these last couple of years. So my grading system personally, I do literally, you can be a 0, you can be a 100, basically like what you would get written on a test in school. It's out of percentages. So if you were 100%, you were a literally perfect prospect. If you're about 90%, you should be a top 10 guy, pretty locked in. 85 would be middle to late first rounds. 80 would be kind of a fringe day 1, day 2 guy. Might sneak into the end of the first, might just have to wait till the top of the second, so on and so forth. It kind of just slowly progresses down that. So I've got the list of ones on my phone, so I'm just going to sit here and read these off to you. Guys that I had graded in recent years. Matt Corral, my top graded quarterback from last season, 83.5%. Desmond Ridder, 81%. Trevor Lawrence, my top graded quarterback of 21, I had him at a 93.5%. I really liked Trevor Lawrence coming out of college, but then again, who didn't? Justin Fields, I had a 90.5%, and then Mac Jones, I have an 85%. So now that you can see some of those, I'll actually flash those up on screen with my grades for the rest of these guys, which are as follows. My number 1 quarterback from this year, or from this selection at the bare minimum, Bryce Young. I gave him an 87%, which would make him probably, somewhere between the 10th and the 12th best prospect to me, not including positional value. The next guy I've got, Anthony Richardson. 86% comes in at my quarterback number 2. Number 3, C.J. Stroud at an 85. Very small margins between all of these guys. And then Will Levis being pretty comfortably my worst quarterback of the 4 at 80.5%. That would mean I would more likely than not draft him as a second round option. I wouldn't really consider him much in the first, especially not where we see him getting mocked sometimes. What do you think about where I rank those quarterbacks? Are you a CJ Stroud guy? Are you a Will Levis guy? Anthony Richardson, Bryce Young, any of them? Let me know in the comments. If you want to see me do any more of these head-to-heads, like for the running backs or wide receiver will be one that I've definitely eyeballed and considered doing. Feel free to let me know in the comments. Doesn't even have to be the top of the position. If you want me to compare Hendon Hooker, Max Duggan, Stetson Bennett, and Jaron Hall, I will do that as well. Just all you got to do is ask me. We can talk about it a little bit and, just hear your thoughts on everything that I just talked about. But yeah, this is episode 60 of the From My Perspective podcast. And as always, I'll see you next time.